Hello, this is Max, meeting a girl's parents and relatives for the first time. Prepare to be hypnotized. Don't forget to subscribe. An African-American man is walking down the street at night, feeling uneasy. Just as he finishes his phone call, a car turns towards him. It stops next to him, and some guys drag him into the car to cheerful music saying, "Run, rabbit, run." The credits begin to roll as the car drives away. Photographs on the wall of an apartment. The protagonist, a photographer, is looking through his work. His girlfriend appears at the door. He starts packing his things as his girlfriend begins a conversation. He is worried about the trip because her parents don't know he is black. The couple drives for a long time through a grove of trees. The main character, Chris, is tense and wants to smoke. His girlfriend, Rose, throws the cigarette away. Chris calls his friend Rod and mentions that it's better to stay away from her white parents, jokingly noting that they control him. Suddenly, a deer jumps onto the road. The car hits the animal. Shocked by the incident, they both get out of the car. Hearing the animal's cries, Chris approaches and looks at the dying deer. At the scene, a white police officer asks Chris for his ID, even though Rose was driving. Rose protests against his request, and the officer eventually lets them go. The house they are heading to is secluded and surrounded by forest. As they arrive, Chris notices a strong black man, the gardener, in the yard. They are warmly greeted by Rose's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Armitage, named Dean and Missy. In the living room, the conversation touches on the deer incident, with Dean expressing his opinion on the nuisance they cause. Rose's father asks how long Chris and Rose have been together. Chris says 4 months, but Rose corrects him, saying it's been 5. Chris apologizes. Dean offers to give Chris a tour of the house and mentions that the Armitages are a family of doctors. Missy is a psychiatrist, Dean is a neurosurgeon, and their son is also pursuing a medical career. Pointing to a photograph, Dean recalls the 1936 Berlin Olympics, where his father came in second to a black athlete, undermining Hitler's Aryan supremacy propaganda. Dean's father never fully recovered from this defeat. In the kitchen, the housemaid Georgina stands motionless, smiling at Chris. Sensing Chris's discomfort in a setting where a white family has black servants, Dean assures him that they hired the staff to care for his parents when they were alive and now find it hard to let them go. Outside, Missy asks Chris about his parents. He mentions that he doesn't remember his father well and that his mother died when he was 11. Learning that Chris smokes, Missy offers her hypnotherapy services to help him quit, but Chris declines. A big family gathering is planned for the next day, a tradition for the Armitage family. Rose is surprised that she wasn't informed earlier. At that moment, Georgina, the housemaid, pours drinks for everyone, and Missy sharply tells him to lie down, to which he agrees with a smile. Rose's brother Jeremy arrives, and the family gathers for dinner. When Missy leaves to get dessert, the conversation turns to sports. Jeremy, drunk and tactless, asks Chris about mixed martial arts, persistently commenting on Chris's impressive physique and even attempting a chokehold. Later, alone in their bedroom, Rose expresses her discomfort with her family's behavior towards Chris, but he remains nonchalant. That night, unable to sleep, Chris listens attentively to the sounds around him. He decides to go outside for a smoke and is startled when the gardener, Walter, sprints towards him but runs past without saying a word. Turning back to the house in fright, Chris sees Georgina inside, looking at herself in the window as if it were a mirror. She adjusts her appearance and then suddenly leaves. Chris returns to the house and bumps into Missy, who asks him to sit down and begins a calming conversation about hypnosis and smoking. She also asks about his mother. As she stirs her tea with a spoon, Chris's attention is drawn to the sound of the spoon clinking. He succumbs to hypnosis and starts answering questions about his mother, even though he doesn't want to. On the day of his mother's death, Chris was at home watching TV during a rainstorm. He hears the sound of rain, and his eyes fill with tears as memories resurface. He breathes heavily as Missy implies that his inaction led to his mother's death. Chris cries and scratches the armrests of the chair with his nails, just as he did on the day his mother died. He becomes paralyzed as Missy says, "You will sink into the floor." Chris sinks into the sunken place, a dark space where he can see the world through a small window. His face is frozen in terror. tears streaming down his cheeks as Missy closes his eyes. Chris then abruptly wakes up, noticing his phone has been unplugged from the charger. After taking some photos in the forest, Chris sees Walter, the gardener, chopping wood. When he talks to Walter, Chris notices his odd behavior. Walter compliments Chris on having a wonderful girlfriend, calling her the dream of any man. Walter also mentions that he spent some time alone with Missy in her office. Chris later shares with Rose his experience with the hypnosis and expresses his concerns about Walter's strange behavior. Rose dismisses his worries and jokes about it. Guests start arriving for the big family gathering. Chris and Rose go out to greet them. During the conversation with Chris, the guests make several offensive remarks. Left alone, Chris observes the guests through his camera lens and notices the only other African American among them, a man named Logan King. Logan behaves and speaks in the same peculiar manner as the servants, Walter and Georgina. His partner is a woman much older than him. Chris begins to suspect something is wrong. Chris approaches a blind art dealer named Jim Hudson, who is sitting apart from the group. They recognize each other. Jim knows about Chris's photography, and Chris knows about Jim's gallery. Jim admires the intensity and melancholy in Chris's photographs. Suddenly, the guests fall silent as Chris climbs the stairs to the house. His phone is again unplugged from the charger. Chris, now tense, tells Rose he believes Georgina is unplugging his phone. Rose laughs it off again. Chris talks to his friend Rod on the phone about the strange behavior of the people. Rod, concerned, tells Chris to leave immediately, suggesting that all the black people there might be under hypnosis. After the call, Georgina enters to explain about the phone. Chris tries to be understanding, saying that being around so many white people can make one nervous. Georgina struggles to hold back tears, repeatedly saying, "No, no, no," while continuing to smile. Chris returns to the guests, who are introducing him to their friends. He feels the weight of their curious stares. One guest asks an uncomfortable question about being black. While Logan answers, Chris discreetly tries to take his photo, but the flash goes off. Logan's nose starts to bleed, and he rushes towards Chris, grabbing him and screaming for Chris to get out. Logan is dragged away, crying. Missy and Dean calmly attribute his behavior to an epileptic seizure. Logan later returns, calm and smiling. By the lake, Chris and Rose discuss the incident. Rose believes her father's explanation, given his profession as a neurosurgeon. Chris, however, insists he knows what seizures look like because his friend has epilepsy. Chris realizes he recognizes Logan and believes his mind has been tampered with. He wants to leave, but Rose is upset at the thought of being left alone. Meanwhile, Dean conducts an auction among the guests, putting Chris up for bidding. Jim Hudson wins the auction. Chris, feeling guilty about his mother's death, confides in Rose, who comforts him. Deciding not to leave her, Chris tells Rose they will leave together. As it gets dark, the couple returns to the house. The guests depart, and Rose's parents watch them closely. Chris sends Rod a photo of Logan. Rod immediately calls back, identifying Logan as their mutual acquaintance, Andre Hayworth, who has been missing. Both Rod and Chris realize it's time for Chris to leave. Chris's phone battery dies. He notices a small, partially open door in the room and finds a red box inside containing numerous photos of Rose with other African Americans, including Walter and Georgina. Rose enters, and Chris hurries to leave. At the door, the Armitage family blocks their way. Rose pretends to search for the car keys, but Chris begins to panic, sensing the hopelessness of the situation. He yells at Rose to give him the keys. Dean declares that they are a superior race. Rose stops pretending and reveals she had the keys all along. Missy taps her teacup with a spoon, and Chris falls into the sunken place again. The family drags him away. Rod tries to reach Chris, but fails. He finds information about Andrew's disappearance and becomes increasingly worried. A spacious room with a target on the wall. In the center sits Chris, tied to a chair, with a deer head in front of him and a small TV. Roman Armitage appears on the screen, explaining the procedure. Chris looks at the deer head, then the screen shows a teacup, and he loses consciousness. Rod tries to explain the situation to the police, but they don't believe him. Determined to help his friend, he calls Rose. During their conversation, Rod senses she's lying but can't record the call. Chris wakes up and notices the chair's arm, scratched by his nails. Jim Hudson appears on the TV, explaining the preparation stages and the upcoming brain transplant operation, which will leave Chris as a passenger in his own body. The TV turns off, and Chris notices the stuffing coming out of the chair. When the teacup appears on the screen again, he loses consciousness. Dean Armitage prepares for the operation while Jim Hudson lies on a couch. The doctor removes Jim's scalp. Jeremy comes to fetch Chris, unstraps him, and Chris knocks him out while he's distracted. Chris removes the earplugs he'd used to block the hypnosis trigger. He then kills Dean with the antlers of the deer head. Chris continues through the house. Missy confronts him, but he breaks the cup and she stabs his hand. Using the same knife, still stuck in his hand, Chris kills Missy. He takes the car keys and heads outside. Rose, oblivious and listening to music, is looking for her next victim. Chris gets into a white car and hits Georgina. Overcoming his childhood fear, he decides to help her and places her in the passenger seat. Rose, watching with a rifle, calls out, "Grandma," and Georgina turns to attack Chris. In the struggle, the car crashes into a tree and Georgina is knocked unconscious. Rose shoots at the car's side mirror as Chris limps away into the woods. She reloads the rifle and asks Grandpa, the gardener Walter, to catch him. Walter pounces on Chris and starts a fight. Chris uses his phone's flash to bring Walter back to his senses. Walter tells Rose he'll handle Chris himself, then takes the rifle and shoots Rose. He then shoots himself. Chris reaches for the rifle as Rose, injured, reaches for him. They place their hands on the gun together, and Rose says she loves him. Chris starts to strangle her but stops. A police car arrives, and Rod steps out. Together, they head to the car, leaving Rose to watch them drive away. The film ends there. If you are interested in such films, please proceed to the next video on the screen and also share your thoughts about this film in the comments. Give us a like and subscribe. Goodbye.